these updates and respond to your questions about regulatory compliance for first aid. Over the last few months, our team has been fielding many questions related to training, plans, and requirements. Today, we have asked WorkSafe BC to join us to help clarify the regulations that will be going into effect on November 1st of this year, 2024. Our presenters today will also share additional resources, information, and what support is available to help you ensure that your first aid policies meet compliance. Joining me today are Kim Stubbs from WorkSafe BC and our very own Heidi Hare, a Senior Safety Specialist here at the Alliance. Start with Kim. Since 2000, Kim has worked at WorkSafe BC to help employers get the information they need to implement prevention activities. She is currently an OHS consultant for the manufacturing and transportation industries. Based in our Kelowna office, Heidi brings more than 14 years of occupational health and safety experience from a wide range of industries. Her goal is to work collaboratively with members to continually improve worker safety. So Kim will begin the webinar today with the updates and clarification on the first aid changes from WorkSafe BC. Heidi will then step in to share how our team at the Alliance can help support you as you review your first aid program. So if we do have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And this can be done at any time throughout the session. And now, happy to present Kim, who will get into today's topic. Welcome, Kim.
Good morning, everyone. I just get my screen shared. We're good?
You're good?
All right, good morning, everyone. So we'll just get started. So in April of 2023, the Board of Directors at WorkSafe BC approved amendments to Part 3 of the regulation, which are the provisions for occupational first aid. These amendments will actually come into effect this year on November 1st. So this implementation time lag from April to November was designed on purpose to allow employers and training providers time to get prepared for the upcoming changes. These amendments will apply to all industries and all workplaces. Some of the key changes are particularly relevant for work sites that have remote and/or work sites that have significant barriers when summoning or delivering first aid. Some workplaces that are in compliance with the current regulation today may even notice minor changes. So in this presentation, I know there's a lot of questions. I hope to answer hopefully answer all of your questions. And if I can't, then of course the team at MSABC is also there to help you. I apologize, I'm not used to toggling two screens, so I have to toggle two screens. So why the changes? The requirements for first aid have actually been in place for almost 20 years, and during that time, there have been minimal changes. Because of this, there were several considerations that formed the rationale for amending these regulations. Some of those reasons were employers tended to default to the bare minimum of first aid requirements without any consideration for specific workplace or work process hazards. So this actually identified a need to build a more robust first aid assessment that builds on the minimum first aid requirements. Investigations submitted not only by employers, but findings from WorkSafe BC investigations found gaps and deficiencies related to first aid services and emergency transport, again, particularly for injured workers in remote areas, as well as work sites with significant barriers to first aid. And then another reason, of course, was the implementation of the national standards across Canada. So previously, first aid was legislated provincially, and this varied by each province. This created a lot of confusion for companies that operate across Canada with interprovincial employees, and it became a contributing factor towards a push for a unified standard of first aid in Canada. So that being the Canadian Standards Association CSA Z 1210-17 for first aid training, and CSA Z 1220-17 for first aid kit requirements, which have now been adopted in most provinces in Canada. BC coming on board just a little bit later than some other provinces. So harmonizing with these two CSA standards is intended to help with labor mobility, which allows qualified workers coming into BC to use their first aid certificates obtained from other provinces. So in this presentation, I'm going to introduce you to some new concepts, one being workplace class, and this was created to enhance transportation and equipment requirements for remote and less accessible workplaces or work locations. There's the new first aid assessment process. This includes amended requirements, those being an employer's two-part duty, documenting as part of due diligence and involving your joint health and safety committee members or designated worker rep in preparing, reviewing, and updating assessments. And then also the requirements for annual first aid drills has been added to the regulation. This was actually in the current guideline, but it was just the language was moved into, into the regulation. And then of course, alignment with the CSA standards, which changed the naming convention for first aid certifications. So I'm just going to start off with the concept of workplace class. So determining your workplace class is a change in the first aid assessment process. The minimum requirements for first aid are now split into 4 separate tables, and figuring out your workplace class tells you which table to look at to determine your number of attendants, your equipment, and your facilities required. If we look at the definitions, so the definition for remote is workplaces to which under normal travel conditions, an ambulance that is a motor vehicle cannot travel from its base in 30 minutes or less. What is normal travel conditions? They are determined by the average time it takes to drive to and from the nearest ambulance station by a motor vehicle which follows the rules of the road during the normal working hours of the employer's workplace. So the distance is actually from the ambulance station to your work site. So it's no longer from your work site to the nearest hospital. So if your work site is more than, say, 30 minutes from an ambulance station, normal driving time, then you are considered remote. And then the team at MSABC will put a link in the chat as to a map for the nearest ambulance station. You can also Google BCEHS ambulance station and they'll come up with a map, but we'll put a link in the chat for you so that you have access to that. So the other definition is less accessible. So less accessible is a workplace which includes work areas that cannot be reached by an ambulance traveling by land, or a workplace where ambulance attendants cannot safely access. And so what does that mean? So we've got some examples here. So this includes work sites that cannot easily be reached by ambulance traveling by land, like I had said, as well as those where ambulance attendants may not be able to access an injured worker safely. So BCEHS will generally not access the following areas. So we have backcountries that's accessible by ATV or snowmobile, areas where there's steep or slope embankments, private industrial roads, anywhere where there's a potential of avalanche or landslides. Those are some examples where BC Ambulance cannot access. Some other examples, so BCEHS will also not rescue injured workers from hazardous work areas such as these. So you got confined space, underground workings, excavations, areas that require specialized PPE where there may be a potential for a hazardous atmosphere. In the guideline, though, there is an exclusion to being less accessible, and this would be when the location is not remote and the employer has developed alternative provisions to safely rescue workers. So if I give you an example, let's take, for example, if we have a winery that's operating in the Lower Mainland, they're 9 minutes away from an ambulance station. The workers regularly enter the fermentation tank during the crush season, and they do have a confined space program with confined space procedures. So in this scenario, the employer is not remote, and they are working in a hazardous area, which is the confined space tank. But they do have confined space rescue procedures in place. So even though this employer does conduct confined space work, and you would look by in this, they are listed as a less accessible area, they fall under the exclusion based on all the parameters in the exception. So if your work site does have hazardous work areas similar to the ones on the screen, and you cannot determine if you are less accessible or not when you're conducting your first aid assessment, I highly recommend that you reach out to the team at MSA and they can assist you, or you can contact myself, or you can also contact your local prevention officer. And I promise we're going to go through an example of a first aid assessment. It does make a little bit more sense when you walk through the actual process. And you can hold me to my promise. So on this slide here, when we talk about workplace class, keep the definitions of remote and less accessible in the top of your mind. And you determine your workplace class through the definitions of remote and less accessible. So if we go back to this winery example, I had said that the winery was 9 minutes away from an ambulance station. So if we're looking at the table, I lost my mouse. If we look at this table, because it's 9 minutes away from an ambulance station, it is not remote. So that would be a no. Again, I had said that they do work in a confined space, but they have confined space procedures. So then they would fall under the exclusion. So they are not less accessible. So for the wine example, they would be looking at their workplace class 1, and they would be looking at Schedule 3A reference table 3-1. If you scan this QR code, that'll take you to a document that lists Schedule 3A, which shows all of the 4 different tables. And then we'll also put the link in the chat for you, so you've got access to that. Now I'm going to ask you, if you consider the same winery, and if we keep everything the same, they still work in the fermentation tank, it's still a confined space, they've got a confined space program with procedures, but let's assume that they are 40 minutes away from an ambulance station. Which workplace class do you actually think that they would fall in? And I'm going to ask you just to put in the chat what you think it is. We're going to, as we work through a first aid assessment, we're going to come back and then you'll find out the answer to that. But I'm just curious, put in the chat and let's just see which workplace class most of you think that that's going to be in. Okay, so this regulation now, it sets a stage for what we call a 2-part duty on an employer when they're conducting the first aid assessment. So the first part of the 2-part duty requires the employer to determine the minimum level of first aid based on workplace class, the number of workers, and the hazard rating. The second part of the employer's 2-part duty is to consider any additional equipment supplies required. So this means that you're looking at your work location, you're looking at your work processes, and you're determining what is unique. Are there any additional hazards or barriers specific to your work site that may impact the provisions for first aid? So an example would be, are you using a specific chemical that has certain properties that require a specific first aid treatment? And that's the second part of the employer's 2-part duty that's now required when you're doing your first aid assessment. Okay, so now we're going to actually look at the new first aid assessment worksheet. It was available at the beginning of July. We'll put a link in the chat for you so that you can actually access the new template. So this PDF template was available at the beginning of July. There is going to be a digital app that comes out in the fall. I believe it's supposed to be coming out in October or September. I hear it's supposed to be really good and they're incorporating AI. I hear it's going to be a great tool. But for now, we've got the first aid assessment worksheet form. So we're just going to walk through the exact same wine scenario and walk through all the different definitions and how you would actually fill it out. So on this screen here, so this is the new first aid assessment worksheet. The very first part of this is actually just the employer's tombstone information. So you'd enter your name. Of course, one of the new requirements now is that you have to involve your workers and your joint health and safety committee members. So any workers that were consulted, you would have to enter their names, put a check mark if you've involved your joint health and safety committee, which is a requirement. So that's just tombstone information. The first step of the assessment is to determine the number of workers. So workers could include managers, supervisors, administrative staff, anybody who regularly accesses the workplace. And then if you have a different number of workers on different shifts, an assessment may be required for the different shifts. In the guideline, there is direction on how to calculate the number of workers if you've got like multiple work sites or if you've got dispatched workers. But for the sake of time, if that scenario pertains to you, I would suggest that you read the guideline, or you can also contact MSABC to work you through how to determine the number of workers. For dispatch workers, there is a bit of an algorithm in the guideline. So once you determine the number of workers, then the next step is to determine your hazard rating. And again, in the new first aid assessment tool, wherever there's other documents, we've put in a QR code, and that would take you right to the document required. So an easy way to determine your hazard rating, if you scan the QR code, that takes you to a document that lists all of the industries with all of the hazard ratings. And of course, the hazard rating is assigned by WorkSafe BC to each industry classification unit, and it's based on claim statistics and knowledge of common hazards typically associated with workplaces assigned to that CU. And it's always rated as low, moderate, or high. An employer's Hazard rating can also be found on the CU descriptions sent to employers in their assessments rate letter, which usually comes out every year in November. You can also go to the WorkSafe BC website, and we've got a tool there where you can enter the name of your industry, and it'll pop up with your CU, which then takes you to your hazard rating. So the hazard rating assigned by WorkSafe BC should be considered the minimum acceptable hazard rating, but of course there are some exceptions. Some of those exceptions are if you operate a separate administrative workplace where the typical hazards of the industry are not present, you can have a low hazard rating for that administrative workplace. If you have multiple workplaces where the work is phased and not all phases have the same hazards present. So an example would be a prime contractor in residential construction. The framing stage would be a different hazard rating, say, than the finishing stage. Another exception would be CUs that are not assigned a hazard rating. So that would be an example, would be a new CU. Another example would be workplaces where it's determined that the work being done aligns better with a different CU. For all of these exceptions, though, it is critical that the decision is justified in your hazard assessment and that you involve worker consultation. And of course, if you use a hazard rating that's assigned with an alternative CU, it must not be used to reduce your hazard rating during certain times, tasks, or areas of the workplace when the work is generally consistent with your assigned CU. So the next page of the first aid assessment worksheet is to determine your workplace class, which is again based on the definitions of remote and less accessible. So I'm going to go back to the wine example and the mock-up that I've put in this particular assessment. So the winery again was 9 minutes away. So we've got 9 minutes away from an ambulance station, which means because it's under 30 that they are not remote. To make this example a bit simple, I've left out, we're not having them as a group 1 exclusion. So because they're in the lower mainland, there's no backcountry areas, it's in the lower mainland. So I haven't checked off anything in this group 1 area. But again, remember the workers at the winery often work in the fermentation tank, and they do have confined spaces that they regularly work in. So we have to check off confined space. And then as we look down and go through the assessment, the new assessment sheet, down at the bottom here is where you have your exceptions, or I should say your exclusion. So in this example, again, because this employer was 9 minutes away, it's not a remote workstation, workplace. There are no boxes in group 1 that were selected, and they do have a confined space program and they have confined space rescue procedures. So we put a check mark in here. So in this example, I've put a check mark in all 3. And when all 3 apply, this is the exception to the less accessible workplace. That means that this is not a less accessible workplace. So then I would put a check mark here and say this workplace is not less accessible because of the fact that all of these conditions apply and it's part of the exception. So for this example now, they are not remote. So if we look at this here table, they are not remote. So they're not remote and they are not less accessible, which means in this example, this employer would be workplace class 1 and they would look at table 3-1. Now, if we look at again, go back to the other example now, you've got the same winery, same conditions, only they're now 40 minutes away from an ambulance station. And I'm not sure what the answer was, what people put in the chat, because I can't see it, but I would assume there's probably a mix between class 2 and class 4. So again, if we're filling this out for 40 minutes, we would say 40 minutes from an ambulance station. Well, 40 minutes is greater than the 30. So now this particular employer is remote. So you would put a check mark here. Again, same conditions apply. So I'm not going to put any check marks under group 1 because that was not applicable. But again, it's confined space work. So we're putting a check mark here. Now, if I go back to the exclusions, I can't put a check mark on this one here because the workplace is now remote. I'm still going to put a check mark here because nothing was selected in group 1 and they have a confined space procedure. So I'm going to put a check mark here. But because not all 3 were selected, this does not fall under the exception. So this means that this workplace is now less accessible. And if I look at my table, now they are remote. So yes, they're remote and yes, they are less accessible. So the answer to this one would be this particular employer is workplace class 4. So you would now look at table 3-4. And again, when we're following through the first aid assessment, the table is included. So you would just put a check mark. We're going back to the 9-minute scenario from an ambulance station. So this one was again class 1. There's a QR code that takes you to the tables. I took a screenshot just so that you can see table 3-1 and what's in there. And for this particular mock-up, it was 22 workers. So I'm going to look down here for 22 workers. The hazard rating was moderate. So we're going to look over here for moderate. So this tells us that in table 3-1, we're going to look at column 3. And in this column, which I've circled, this tells you what you're going to need for the minimum requirements for first aid. So if we go back to our first aid assessment, we're just going to plunk in what's required for the minimum. So we're going to need an intermediate first aid kit. We're going to need a dressing station, and we're going to need 1 intermediate first aid attendant. And because no requirement was in there for emergency transportation, we're just going to say no emergency transportation was required. So this is basically the first part of the employer's 2-part duty, is to determine what are those minimum requirements for first aid. The next page of the first aid assessment actually walks you through now the second part of the employer's 2-part duty. And again, for the second part of this is where you would determine at your workplace what is unique to you, what is unique to your work location, what is unique to your work processes. Is there anything that is going to impact the provisions for first aid? So what you need to do then is you need to assess the risks and the hazards at your work location and work processes to determine, is there something specific for your organization that you would need for first aid? And again, I'm going to go to, do you use any specific chemicals that may require specific first aid measures? You can also look at what types of injuries are likely to occur at your organization. You can review your first aid records. You can review your incident investigations and any near misses. Are there any additional barriers to first aid? So look at physical obstacles. Maybe there's communication barriers. Maybe there's cultural barriers. Do you interact with the public? Are you going to include the public to be able to provide first aid to the public? For workplaces that require emergency transportation, is there any specialized equipment required for transport and evacuation? So in the second part of the employer's 2-part duty, this is where you would add anything in addition that you want to include. So in my mock-up scenario, I said that the winery has a kitchen and a small restaurant off of the tasting room, and burns are common in the kitchen. So we're not going to just stick with the minimum requirements for first aid. We're going to add cooling packs and burn dressing and hydrogel to our first aid kit. Another example is maybe for this particular employer, I wanted to say we're going to have an AED. So I could also list an AED as additional equipment in addition to the minimum requirements. And I would just write AED in this particular section. So starting in November, the first aid assessment must now be documented. And you also must involve your Joint Health and Safety Committee and designated worker rep in preparing, reviewing, and updating your first aid assessment. First aid assessments must be reviewed and updated at minimum annually or whenever a significant change does occur. Smaller workplaces that don't have a Joint Health and Safety Committee or a designated worker representative are also expected to involve workers in the first aid assessment process. So you could get worker input during a meeting, a safety meeting, or a toolbox talk. But the requirement now is that you're involving workers in the first aid assessment. And the reason for this amendment is really because the people who conduct the work are in the best position to inform the employer of the hazards and the risks associated with the tasks that they are performing. And workers have insight into the challenges present when summoning and receiving first aid. And worker involvement is vital to the success of your first aid program. And just in general, they're vital to the success of your safety management system. So in the guideline, there is a list of procedures that may be required if applicable in your workplace. They're all discussed in detail. Most of the current guideline, these are actually in the current guideline, but in the new preliminary guideline, there's more guidance on what's expected in the procedures. So I would say nothing has really changed. There's just more guidance in terms of what we expect to see in your first aid procedures. And then of course, with any first aid procedure, the workers and the attendants must be trained in the procedures, whatever procedures, of course, pertain to them. Some of these procedures are also required as part of your worker orientation. So the example for that would be how to summon first aid, the location of first aid facilities, how to give first aid during an evacuation. First aid procedures should also be printed and posted throughout the workplace if practicable, including lunchrooms or areas where workers may congregate. And procedures can be made available on a company intranet site or a shared drive, or printed copies for vehicles, cell phones, mobile apps, whatever is going to work for your particular workplace. And again, when you're deciding what's going to work for your workplace, it's critical to involve your workers in the selection of the communication methods that work best. And maybe a combination of the methods may even be what's decided upon. Drills. So I cannot talk enough about the importance of drills. Yes, they do take a long time to prepare. You have to put some thought into it, but it is time that is truly well spent and well worth it. Drills provide you with valuable information because they test the effectiveness of your first aid procedures, and they are also a training tool for those that are involved. When you conduct a drill, you're basically looking for, are you able to access the equipment and supplies and first aid facilities without any impediments? Are workers familiar with the first aid procedures? Do they know the location of the equipment or the facilities? How much time did it take the attendant to get summoned? How effectively the attendant was able to respond to both minor and major injuries? And if you've got multiple attendants, was it easy for them to coordinate their efforts? How effectively can an injured worker be assessed and moved? And are there any barriers present that you hadn't thought of? How effectively can an injured worker be prepared and packaged and transported in an accessible area to ambulance? Did the attendant conduct the proper documentation and reporting requirements? And one of the ones that always caught me when I did my first aid drills was, are your communication devices fully charged? Usually it was during the drill that we found out that all of our communication devices were actually not charged and we needed new batteries. After the drill, if you have identified any gaps and deficiencies, you can involve your workers and the attendants to find appropriate solutions. Your workers and attendants then learn their responsibilities and they become invested into what you are trying to achieve, which is basically effective and efficient first aid services. So working through a drill helps everyone know and understand their roles during times that are particularly stressful times. Drills should be conducted as soon as practicable following the implementation of procedures, and at the very least annually, or when there are substantive changes. And substantive changes in procedures can be different transportation methods. So let's say that you move from using a taxi to an ETV. Maybe you've got a new way to summon first aid. So you're switching from a two-way radio to a flashing light system. So those are examples when those are substantive changes and you want to practice your drills after that. Employers are required to maintain drill records to establish compliance for due diligence purposes. And BCEHS should not be contacted for the purpose of conducting drills. And you can actually incorporate what to expect in a 911 call in your drill. And we'll put a link in the website so that most people haven't called 911, so you don't know what to expect. But it's a good idea to incorporate some of that into your drill because it may change the way that you write your procedures. Drills should also not pose an undue hazard to the attendants or workers participating, so you can use a tabletop exercise to supplement in these conditions. And then, of course, the results of drills should be shared with your Joint Health and Safety Committee members or your designated worker representative. So alignment with CSA Z1210 for first aid training really affects the naming convention and the course duration for first aid programs. If you're used to the old way of the naming system, this is a little bit to wrap your head around. So a level 1 is now will now be called a basic. An OFA level 2 will now be called an intermediate, and an OFA level 3 will now be called an advanced first aid attendant. And the other difference is that OFA level 2, or the intermediate first aid, is going from 5 days down to 2 days. And one of the questions that we get asked a lot is why the decrease in days for training. So the course competencies from the OFA level 2 versus the CSA intermediate are very similar. There's going to be less practice time and there's no standalone practical examination. So for the CSA intermediate training, competencies are actually going to be assessed throughout the duration of the 2-day course. And that's part of the rationale why we've gone down from the 5 days to the 2-day for training. The transportation endorsements competencies that remains unaffected by the transition to the CSA aligned training. So that stays the same. On July 2nd, the new CSA aligned curriculum was made available to the training providers. So many providers are going to need time to prepare for the new course so that they can offer them to the public. Some are prepared and already offering the course right now. All OFA certificates will be valid until their expiration date. So after October 31st, active OFA certificates will become equivalent to basic, intermediate, and advanced. So for example, if you have an OFA level 1 that was issued on April 9th, 2024, they will be valid until April 9th, 2027. So after their 3 years, they will expire. All OFA 2 certificates expiring between July 2nd and October 30th of this year, 2024, will be accepted as valid through to October 31st. So you do not need to hold an intermediate certificate until November 1st. So we're giving an extension to only OFA 2s. So this extension does not apply to OFA 1 or OFA 3. And if you add a brand new intermediate attendant to your workplace before November 1st, there will be an exception that you are complying with the amended regulations prior to November 1st. So the expectation will be that you've at least conducted a first aid assessment based on the new first aid assessment process. And this again is if you're adding a brand new intermediate attendant, not somebody who already has their OFA 2 and they're getting the extension. OFA training will actually be ending on should be ending on August 31st. So starting on September 1st, it's anticipated that all training providers will only be offering the CSA aligned programs. And then of course, I just want to say, make sure that you're using WorkSafe BC approved training providers, and we'll put a link to the document in the chat for you. And I believe that link was updated fairly recently in July of this year. And it will be updated again as more training providers come on board and they're prepared for the CSA aligned training, the list will be updated. So first aid kit requirements are also changing based on CSA Z 1220. The detailed kits are actually now available in the preliminary guideline. Employers are expected to move to these new contents as new kits are purchased or supplies are replaced. So you do not need to get rid of your OFA kits, but you do need to acquire the supplemental items to be compliant with the CSA kits. If you're purchasing a brand new CSA kit, make sure that you get medium. So on some supplier sites, you can purchase type 2 and type 3 kits that will say small. Make sure that you get the ones that say medium, because it's the medium is the one that you're required to be compliant. Changes to emergency transport vehicle equipment, first aid room equipment, and dressing station equipment are all minor. So the changes are really just in terminology and the inclusion of new materials into the first aid kits. So for example, the number of splints required in a first aid room are now decreased because they're actually included in the CSA kit. And just a note on that, now is the time really to go through if you have a first aid room or a dressing station, go through all your inventory, because you may find that you may not have to actually purchase any additional supplies because you've already got them in your first aid room and your dressing station. So now is really the time to go through all your supplies and see what you have on stock. And I put this slide on here because I personally thought that it was convenient. This gives you an idea of what's changing from the old OFA kits to the new CSA aligned kits. And again, there is no expectation for employers to dispose of any existing first aid supplies. And I heard a rumor, don't quote me, I heard that there are going to be some suppliers that are potentially going to be making supplemental kits to the OFA kits. But again, don't quote me on that at this point. It's just a rumor. It would be, hopefully somebody does, because it would be a good business to be in. But you can see here, so for example, for the basic, it's just a few minor changes. You're adding a few extra adhesive bandages, one pressure dressing, hand cleaning towelettes, and you may already have this in a first aid room or a dressing station and you've got the right amount of supplies. So it's a good time again to check all of your inventory and see what you actually do need. So the most recent news, of course, with the new CSA aligned, the most recent news is the CSA aligned curriculum that went to the training providers on July 2nd. So you're going to see some courses that are now available. Make sure that you're registering for a course that says CSA aligned. The first aid assessment document got posted in July, and the new tool will be coming in the fall, the digital tool. And then, of course, there's going to be a lot more WorkSafe BC resources that are going to get posted on our website. So I would recommend that you sign up for e-news, and then you can get an email from us as soon as that stuff becomes available. And we'll put a link in the chat there for the e-news if you would like to sign up for that. This is just a high-level summary of the guideline changes. So really, the new guidelines primarily will reflect new requirements or areas where clarification was required. The retired sections are now incorporated into other areas. So to give an example, AEDs are now incorporated into the first aid assessment section under other equipment considerations. And there was significant feedback on the draft regulation and the draft guideline. It was actually, for this implementation, it was a unique circumstance that the guideline got posted for public consultation. And the reason for that is, again, is because first aid affects everybody in BC. But when these drafts got posted for public consultation, this was an opportunity for the public to supply their feedback. And this is basically, you have a voice, and this is your opportunity to voice your likes and your dislikes on the proposed regulations or guidelines. And if you want to know about any other guideline changes, sign up for e-news, and then there's a tab there where you can pick to get notified when any of the regulations go out for public consult. But for first aid, there was a significant amount of feedback that came in. There was a lot of change because there was a lot of public feedback, but that just is a testament to people providing their voices, and it makes the regulations and the guidelines better because you're providing comment and you're telling us what's going to work and not work for you. And every single comment that comes in is read and evaluated. So just a summary of some key considerations. So of course, the preliminary guideline was posted in June. The final will be coming out, but there's not going to be much change from the final guideline to the preliminary. It's mostly just going to be a couple of grammatical changes. Otherwise, the preliminary is pretty much the final. OFA certificates will remain valid until they expire. There's going to be extensions for expiring OFA certificates. So again, if you have an OFA 2 certificate and you're expiring between July 2nd and October 30th, you're going to get an extension. First aid kits do not need to be replaced to align with the CSA aligned kits. You simply need to purchase any additional equipment that you may be missing. And now is the time really to start to review and update your first aid program and your procedures. And for some employers, these updates may actually be minimal. And then again, I recommend connecting with the team at MSABC or myself or your local prevention officer if you require any, if you have any additional questions that can't be answered at the end of this webinar. And that's it for me.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Kim. That was a fantastic and thorough presentation of what is a very important topic. This was certainly timely, and I believe it has helped to clarify the upcoming regulation enhancements. So thank you. Next, I'd like to welcome Heidi to discuss how MSABC can help navigate the upcoming changes.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you, Kim. That was an excellent update. Very much appreciate that. You're going to see from my presentation that a lot of Kim's stuff has been covered in here, but I just want to make sure we're going through this so that we are very clear on what we're going to do and how MSABC can help support you with these changes. There we go. So our timeline. So some of you may have seen these timelines before. So we are in, we'll call it phase 2 right now. So what we need to be doing is implementing our action plans. They should already be in place, and we should be looking at this stuff very, very thoroughly. As Kim had said, the CSA standards are out there for updating all the first aid supplies. I really like that little list she had, and we'll see if we can capture that and send that out as well. So it's not as crazy as we think it is. And like she said, please do not throw out your current kits. We just need to update them with a little bit of things, some more Band-Aids, some tourniquets, that sort of thing. We do have access to the CSA standard. We have a little how to get access to that. Because the CSA standard is cited in the regulation, it has to be made available to Canadian workplaces for free. Normally you have to pay for a CSA standard, but because it is cited in regulation, it is required and they allow access to it. You're going to find that the training is not accessible because that's not every workplace, but the CSA standard for the kits are. So if you need that information, feel free to reach out. And we can also make sure that that little information blurb on how to access it is sent with this presentation as well. So what do we need to start doing here? We need, as Kim said, right now we've got that the OFA 2s. If they are expiring between now and October 30th, we have to make sure they complete the new training. And that again is only for the OFA 2s. There is the list out there for the current training providers, and it's great that you're going to be in full compliance, because there was a concern that if we train to the current intermediate, that we're not going to be in compliant because it's different, but it's good to see that it is fully compliant. And again, anything that was issued in 2024 is good for the 3 years that it is valid for. We have to develop our first aid training modules. Hopefully we've started this with our joint committees already. Okay, procedures, programs, updating our communication protocols, working with the joint committee to update programs, or your safety rep if you have this health and safety rep. We need to make sure that we are looking at desktop drills. Okay, so we might not need to do them, sorry, not desktop, we'll call them tabletop. Let's look at what we need to do. What is our most complex first aid response that we're going to have within our organization, and make sure that our communication protocols, our supplies, our resources, do we have enough attendance? Is this happening at night? Is it happening during the day? What are our barriers to it? So let's make sure that we are doing these tabletop drills and figure it out, so that when it's time to come in phase 3, we're going to make sure that we have everything ready to practice that drill. The big one, again, I'm going to say communication piece is key. Like Kim said, that's when we find out that our radios are not charged. Who has the cell phone? Where is it? It's supposed to be in the office. What's going on? The kit's been opened up. We don't have enough supplies. Who took the ropes for putting people together in the packaging? And, you know, where's my sked, right? Maybe somebody took it in the middle of winter and decided to go tobogganing down the hill or something like that. So we want to make sure that everything is ready and we practice that drill. Okay. We can also include that with the nice example that Kim gave us for the confined space. You have to do a mock rescue for your confined space. Perhaps we throw in your first aid drill with the mock rescue and make sure that communication piece is also there, and we get both drills done in one fell swoop. Okay. Make sure that your training is finalized. Go through and make sure that those level 2s, that intermediate, are getting the training they need before October 30th, and have that in place. Okay. You have to make sure that you're doing your risk assessments as well and completing the first aid assessment. Not lots of great resources there. The form is actually really simple to follow, and I really like it. And I'm excited to hear that there's an app for that, because, you know, we all love the app for that. But it should be completed by your joint health and safety committee. We can also be here to help you with that if you need to. We can also assist with your desktop drills as well. So, and your actual practical drills. We have no problem coming to site and helping out with things like that. So please feel free to reach out. We do have our first aid template programs, and we have the updated parts to the regulations inserted in that and ready to go. We have first aid procedures that are going to meet all the requirements as outlined in WorkSafe BC. Again, we can assist with your tabletop exercises for first aid drills. We can also assist with the first aid drills depending on where you are and how complex it is. And we can help you, of course, with the first aid risk assessment. So please feel free to reach out to any one of our advisors at any time for any help with any of this. And there's our contact information, and I believe we are going to open it up to Q&A. And again, I thank you very much, Kim, for this. And it was very, very informative. My note page is very full, and I got a lot of updates from it. So we'll open it up to the floor for questions now.
So you're keeping me on my toes. I'm just going to correct you on one thing.
Excellent.
The OFA 2 are actually, if you're expiring between July 2nd and October 30th, you're getting an extension. So you don't have to register for the intermediate training until November 1st. Perfect. So the extension only applies for OFA 2, not for OFA 1 or OFA 3. If you want to be proactive, though, if you've got an OA 2, you can. You can be proactive. You don't have to comply with their legislation. It was only net new intermediates that you would have to start being compliant. Gets a little bit tricky. The gist is if you're a current OFA2, you get an extension, or you can be proactive and register.
Great. Thanks, Kim, for the clarification. And thank you, Heidi. You mentioned a number of preliminary and proactive measures that our members and non-members alike can take to help ease the transition. So really appreciate that. So as Heidi did mention, we will open the floor to questions now. And I hope you both have a glass of water or something in front of you because they came in fast and furious. There are a number of questions to answer. So let's hop right into it. And just as a quick reminder, if you have a question to ask, something burning, but you have yet to do so, please just fill it out in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so I have a question here for you, Kim. Has WorkSafe BC confirmed with BC EHS that ambulance stations will always be staffed during work hours?
Yes. The team that worked through the regulation, they were in constant contact with BCHS. And as they were going through this regulation, they were confirming that they've got agreements in place to make sure.
Okay, awesome. And here's kind of an interesting one. Field it to you, Kim, again, sorry. If someone here, our facility is in the greater Vancouver area, so not considered remote. However, during times of high traffic, where it may take more than 20 minutes or 30 minutes to get to a first care center, would this deem the workplace remote?
No, because in the guideline, there is language about normal driving conditions. So it's not normal driving for an ambulance, it's normal driving by vehicle. That's how you would determine it. So it wouldn't, yeah, traffic doesn't have to come into play.
Okay, fantastic.
And in the guideline, it does explicitly say, and I think I quoted exactly what it says.
Perfect. With the prime contractor, so CU example, the form asks for one CU. If the finishing stage is still multiple employees doing painting and other work like janitorial services, both hazards, can you still classify as a lower CU? Which would you choose?
So when you're doing your assessment, the intent is not to go down in terms of requirements. So you would do your assessment based on what's required at the higher requirement and stay with that. The intent isn't to bring it down.
Okay, perfect.
I can maybe add to that a little, Brendan.
Yeah.
So prime contractor is going to be responsible for overall site first aid requirements. So they're going to take into consideration all contractors, subcontractors, and employees on site. So if the prime contractor has 20 people, but they've got 4 subcontractors on site with 20 people each, that's going to bump up their numbers, and they're going to take into the highest risk work going on and the location, etc. Within that, right now, you would have those subcontractors would be responsible for their first aid to be able to immediately affect first aid to their crew, communicate to and signal to prime contractor first aid to come and support and take over, etc. So you would have enough first aid available to affect it immediately to your crew, summon first aid on site, and then first aid requirements from prime would take over and make sure that you have correct numbers and facilities available.
Yeah, that was wonderfully said. Better than me.
Awesome. Sorry, give me 2 seconds here.
Water is a good idea, Kim.
I only see 3 questions in the thing. Is there more than 3?
I know.
Yeah, I have a large list of them. I'm just trying to skim through. Okay, so this is an interesting one, and I'll field it to you, Heidi. We know every employer has a confined space on their premises, or maybe not everyone, but most employers do. And they do have respective confined space procedures. How would the confined space procedures need to be updated in light of these upcoming first aid regulation changes?
So you would just have in your rescue response a communication piece. There's no details in your rescue for very specific first aid response. There'll be a communication piece to say you will standby person entrant will summon first aid as horn, whistle, phone, whatever it is. You're going to have that. So you should not have to update your confined space entry procedures or rescue unless your communication piece to first aid for summoning them changes. They should be standalone for first aid response.
Okay.
And just to add to it, if you do change it though, then I would go through and do a drill with your first aid.
Yes, yeah. I would say that with the drills, if you have a confined space, you should, as I said in my little presentation, include the first aid response in your mock rescue drill for confined space. So instead of just saying, hey, we're going to call first aid, call them, respond to them. Does it take them 20 minutes for them to get to you in the right area of the plant? Can they get their equipment properly? Have they communicated properly? Was somebody able to phone 911 and initiate emergency response to show up and get the ambulance there? So you throw that in there and it becomes, if that's your most complex rescue, then, or complex first aid, I would highly recommend including it in that.
Great. Speaking of drills, I have a question for both of you, actually. Who are the target of the drills? Who should be involved in the drills? Is it only for OFA attendants for first aid drills? Can it be combined with other emergency drills? How would you go about proceeding with a first aid emergency drill?
Would you like me to respond first, Kim, or would you like to?
Doesn't matter. I have a lot to say when it comes to drills. You can go first.
Yeah, I probably don't have as much. First aid should include your first aid attendants. They should include your workers. They should include any specialized rescue team. They should include supervisors. Again, that communication piece is key. Does somebody have to go and meet you at a locked door, gate to the facility, etc.? So whoever is going to be involved, workers should know, how do I even call first aid, right? What's happening going on here? Where is the number? Where is the phone? Where is the whistle? Where is the horn? So it should involve everybody within your facility to an extent. If we're doing an evacuation, do we have first aid involved with that? Does somebody know where to go? Do we have our little reprieve sites that somebody's going to go check, etc.? So I would say it involves just about everyone. And then I'll let Kim answer.
I agree. It's for you to think through what would work best. So like some of the drills that I've organized before for first aid is I found that if you incorporate first aid into your emergency drills, it can get very convoluted. And sometimes during an evacuation, sometimes a real emergency happens. So you also have to make sure that you've got procedures in place for if a real emergency happens for first aid during the middle of an evacuation drill, how are you going to handle that? So from my personal experience, I found that if you kind of separate an evacuation drill from a first aid drill, because the first aid drill is really just to focus on first aid and the first aid procedures and who's involved in the first aid procedures. If after you've done this a few times and you're comfortable and you want to start to make it a bit more complicated and involve like first aid during an evacuation, you can add to that. But if you haven't done a drill before, I would stick to something in terms of go with just the first aid procedure and what are you trying to test to make sure that it's effective, and then build on that over time. But yes, it has to involve all of your first aid attendants for sure. Anybody who's involved in the procedure. If you've got corporate security in your procedure, or security guards, I should say, if you've got security guards in your procedure, involve them, because again, they're maybe the ones that direct where the ambulance goes. So you have to really look at your facility and look at your procedure and figure out who are you trying to test on this procedure and this drill.
Awesome. Great guidance. Unfortunately, I think that's all the questions we're going to be able to fit in for today. However, I believe there's going to be opportunities to ask more questions to our advisors here. And of course, you can reach out to WorkSafe BC, I'm sure, with questions of your own. So thank you again, Kim and Heidi, for joining us today to share your expertise. Very much appreciated. I'm sure everyone online here appreciated it as well. And to everyone in the audience, thank you for your questions. We'll do our best to respond to all the questions we have missed in the follow-up email, and we'll share that along with the recording of the presentation from today's webinar. If you're looking for assistance with risk assessment, compliance, or specialized assessments, reach out to our team at the Alliance anytime. Our resources and services are available to both members and non-members alike, of course. You can reach out to us directly, given the contact information that Heidi provided earlier, to find out more if you're indeed a member and to learn more about how we can help. So at MSABC, we have a team of experts specializing in everything from mental health to ergonomics to occupational hygiene and even safeguarding and industrial racking. We can provide guidance for all of your health and safety opportunities. You just got to ask the question. Whether you require a general overview of the state of your health and safety program, a finger on the pulse, so to speak, training or more specialized services such as ergonomics, air quality, or noise assessments, MSABC has you covered. And then I did mention training there. It would be remiss if I did not tell everyone here about a summer promo we are running. There are some savings to be had. So if you're looking for online training for your team, of which we have a lot available, what better time to do it than the present? Purchase any of our online courses before August 31st and save 25%. And of course, one more plug. Register now to join us at Make It Safe in Vancouver for August 9th and 10th. It's spanning 2 days this year. And get a complimentary pass to the October Make It Safe online event with your tickets. We have 2 very important and interesting conferences coming up with a number of great keynote speakers. We've expanded the program this year with practical workshops for safety professionals and committees, business leaders and supervisors, and HR. So we have a bit of information for everyone. As I understand it, it's a lot of presentations on the first day, a lot of good information sharing, and workshops on the second day to gain that practical aspect. So group rates are also available to help you train your team for less. And visit us online anytime for help or to access our full library of webinars, resources, and training. Watch for an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of today's session. And if you would be so kind, there will be a survey link as well. So please share your feedback and any topic ideas for future webinars. All right, thank you again for attending. Everyone have yourselves a great day and great rest of the week.